Let's jump in. Here, the topic for today is Malchiot and Shofarot. Without tshuva, what meaning does the shofar have? So, again, if you weren't in last week's shir, then I suggest going back to the recording and catching up, because this is really part two of a two-part shir. We established last week that the main theme of Rosh Hashanah is kingship, Malchiot, and that splits or divides into two manifestations or two aspects of the concept of kingship. One is that the king is the judge, mishpat, and that's reflected in the tefillah of zichronot. So from that perspective, we talk about Rosh Hashanah as a day in which we accept the authority of God as our judge and king. A military or king type of mishpat is different than a civil court in that, or civilian court, in that the king has authority to be both the judge and the jury and the prosecution and the defense, right? The king is you stand before your king, you accept the authority of the court. And from that perspective, we suggested that based on the Psukim in Eov, that you really can't start with the request for clemency and the request of tshuva and excusing yourself. You really have to start with an acceptance of whatever mishpat the king, the court of the king authorizes. The authority of the court is what we establish in Rosh Hashanah. And then after the judgment, then we begin the process of tshuva and clement and request of rachamim, etc. That's all the way up through Yom Kippur. But we don't do it in reverse, because if we started with the request of tshuva before we've accepted the authority of the court, it would come across as if we are questioning that judgment in advance. So we're saying, if you're compassionate to us, then we will accept the authority of the court. But if not, we haven't gone through that process yet. So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is counterintuitive. The sequencing, normally we would say, okay, first do tshuva and then come before the court. No, in this context, Rosh Hashanah, the Yom Hadin, the judgment is first. And then we can begin the process of tshuva. So Rosh Hashanah itself, we talked about the fact that you're not allowed to do vidui on Rosh Hashanah, because you're not allowed, right? And vidui is the foundation of tshuva. The concept to me is that you have to accept the authority of the court first. That was part one. However, the other part of the triad of Rosh Hashanah is Malchiot, which divides into Zichronot and Shofarot. And the shofar is the mitzvah of the day. So we haven't really yet explained what the shofar is. I think at the end of the show, we asked a very powerful question, which is that if you look at the Rambam in the Laws of Tshuva, where he talks about the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, first thing he says is, the purpose of the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is not explicitly defined in the Torah. Nonetheless, remez yeshbo, there's a hint, meaning there are verses that tell us a kind of, or a concept that tells us a possible remez to what Rosh Hashanah, Tkiyah Shofar is on Rosh Hashanah. Klamar, yeshanim mishinatchem v'nirdamim hakitzu mitardamatchem v'chapsu b'maasechem v'chizru b'tshuva v'zichru barachem. The notion of awake from your slumber in order to awaken us to tshuva, says the Rambam, is the core of the mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The problem with that interpretation, based on our thesis of last week, is that without vidui, there is no real process of tshuva, and you can't do vidui on Rosh Hashanah. So is there a meaning to the shofar if I'm not saying vidui, and I'm therefore not going through the concept of tshuva as we understand it is to ask God for forgiveness? We're not doing that on Rosh Hashanah. We are acknowledging the authority of the court on Rosh Hashanah. We're not asking God for forgiveness because that comes after Rosh Hashanah, right? That's the whole thing, that it's backwards. So from that perspective, we now need to rethink, reevaluate what is shofarot on Rosh Hashanah and how does it relate to the theme of Malchiot. So that's our challenge. That's our task for today. When we look at the Rishonim and the Gaonim, we start thinking about all the different possible explanations of the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar and Rosh Hashana. The Avud Ram quotes the name of Rav Saadia Gaon, 10 different possible explanations as to what the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar is. And from a philosophical perspective, it's very nice. You can go through them and they're very powerful. The day marks the beginning of creation when we accept the authority of God as king. The first of this is Yemei Tshuva. It reminds us of Har Sinai. It reminds us of the words of the Nevi'im. It reminds us of the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. It reminds us of Akedat Yitzchak. There are lots of different references to the or reasons given for Tkiyat Shofar. The problem is, if I have 10 different explanations as to what Tkiyat Shofar is, that doesn't help me. Right? If I'm trying to narrow down the relationship between Shofar and Malchut and trying to understand what the Shofar is of Rosh Hashanah from a Tanach perspective, starting to deal with 10 different explanations really just means that we're groping in the dark. We don't really have a clear understanding of what it is. Right? If that's our primary first step, then we are missing something. So from that perspective, these 10 explanations are very powerful, but they leave us with a question. What is so 10 different answers doesn't help us. We have to have 10 shiurim to unpack each of those different explanations. So I want to come back to basics. Let's start from the Gemara in Rosh Hashana. Gemara in Rosh Hashana says, "Imu lefanai b'Rosh Hashanah malchiot zichronot v'shofarot." On Rosh Hashanah, there are 3 prayers to recite: kingship, remembrance, and shofarot. 2 of those we spoke about last week: kingship and remembrance, malchiot and zichronot. Malchiot kidei shetamlichuni alechem. Malchiot means you acknowledge, you accept God as our king. Zichronot kidei sheyaleh zichronotchem lifanai letova. Zichronot means mishpat. Zichronot means judgment. And so we talk about the process of judgment so that we will end up with a favorable judgment. That's the concept of Rosh Hashanah. Concludes the Gemara, Uvameh v'shofar. With what? With what does the remembrance come before God? With what is the process of acknowledging God as our king? With what is the tool, the mitzvah of the day? Shofar. So even though the Gemara is referring to the tefillah of shofarot, the concept here is that the shofar isn't just about the tefillah, it's about a tool, it's about a kli, it's about a mechanism for acknowledging, coronating God as king and the process of zichronot. So that's the piece that I want to try to understand. What is it about the shofar and how does that specifically connects it to the concept of God as king or malchiot. And so, like as we identified in the subject of this year, right, the main title of this whole series, which is to look at Tanach themes as they impact our understanding of Rosh Hashanah, I actually want to go back to the world of Tanach and try to understand the mitzvah of shofar or the mitzvah of trua, meaning, remember that in the Torah doesn't say you should blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. I want to make this point clear. The Torah does not say "Tkatem b'shofar b'yom Rosh Hashanah." Doesn't even call Rosh Hashanah a Yom Tkiyat Shofar. The term the Torah uses to describe the day, which we then interpret to refer to the shofar, is Yom Tru'ah. So the core of the mitzvah lies in the concept of a tru'ah. The tru'ah itself is the sound that the shofar makes, as we understand it. The word tru'ah can also mean calling out or crying out, much as it refers to crying out in prayer, is a form of tru'ah. So for example, in Sefer Shmot, we have the following, in the story of Chet HaEgel, Moshe is on the top of the mountain, the people down below are worshiping the golden calf and they're celebrating. Moshe is coming down the mountain and he encounters Yehoshua. And Yehoshua is not with the people, he's just listening to the noise of the camp. And he says, Vayishma Yehoshua et kol ha'am bire'o. Yehoshua heard the voice of the people as they were, what does bire'o mean? Comes the word truah, right? The root of bire'o is the root of truah. It's translated here as they shouted. So Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Truah, it's a day of shouting. How does that connect to the shofar? And he says to Moshe, Vayomer el Moshe, Kol milchama b'machana, I hear the voice of war. In other words, whatever this truah is, whatever this shouting is, or this truah sound that he hears, he says it sounds to him like it is the voice of war. Just going to add the sources for whoever is joining us now. If you, somebody can keep an eye on that. Vayomer ein kol. So Moshe's response is ein kol anot kvav, ein kol anot chalusha. If it was war, I would hear victors and vanquished. I don't hear victors and vanquished. All I hear is crying, screaming, yelling. Kol anot anochi shomea, and that tells Moshe that we're dealing with a different kind of revelry and a different kind of celebration, and that leads off to the story of Chet Egel, not our issue. But the notion that Re'om has something to do with calling out, crying out, maybe a sound of war, maybe a sound of battle, says Yehoshua. And Moshe's response tells me that there's some connection between the concept of Truah and the concept of war. And if you remember our discussion of the Melech that we talked about last week, we said there are two primary functions of a Melech. One is to be the judge, we talked about that, Zichronot, and the other was to be the general who would lead us into battle. Right? The Melech was the Shofet, the Shiat Selefan, it was the head of the army, Shiat Selefan, and Shiat Volefan, will go out and come in with the army. So from that perspective, I'm looking for some theme of the shofar or the truah that links us to the other aspect of Malchios, namely that God is our kind of the general at the head of the army, if you will. Right? We'll see the commander-in-chief in the language of American kind of political structure. But we'll have to see how that plays out. The clearest reference is in Bamidbar. In Bamidbar Perek Yud is where we actually have a very clear definition of the words truah and tkiah. Remember, I'm starting from the sounds the shofar makes, primarily because the mitzvah in the Torah is not shofar. The mitzvah in the Torah is truah. Yom Truat Yelachem. So to understand what the meaning of the words are, then we can go back to the vessel, the utensil, the kli that makes those sounds. But in Bamidbar Perek Yud, Moshe is commanded to make two trumpets, chatzotzot. The role of the chatzotzot in the Beit HaMikdash is very similar to the role of the shofar. There's a whole discussion as to the relationship between them, but for our purposes, they are essentially the same tool. And there, the Torah says the following: Utkatem truah. When will you blow a truah? You will blow a truah v'nasua machanot achanim ke'edma. When the camp on the east side of the camp in the desert, on the east side of the Mishkan, will begin to travel. Utkatem truah shenit v'nasua machanot achanim temana. Truah yitku l'masehem. Whenever the camp traveled, any part of the camp, the east flank, the west flank, whenever the camp traveled, the camp traveled at the sound of a truah. Ubahakilat kahal, when the camp comes to rest and not travel, titka'u v'lo tariu. Then you blow a tkiah and not a truah. These are psukim in the Torah. In other words, the Torah already establishes for us the primary roles of the sounds of the truah and the sounds of the tkiah. If the machaneh of Israel in the desert was a military formation, it was a tzavah. Right? There was the degel, there was a banner, there was the kol yotzei tzavah, it was a military census. They were traveling through the desert as a military formation to go to war. Right? That's why when Moshe says, as the camp would travel, and he says, when the when the ark would begin to travel, the camp would move. What was Moshe's tefillah? Right? Right? The notion that God should scatter our enemies before us. How does scattering our enemies before us connect to the army of Israel? Because the camp of Israel, because the camp of Israel was a military camp. It was moving in formation. It was a machaneh. And so the trua was a sign that it moved ready for war to march forward. The tkiya was a sign that it broke camp, or that it made camp, and that it was resting and not moving. Similarly, from that analogy, the Torah goes on to say, "V'chi tavo milchama ba'artzachem," if there be a war in your land, alatzaret sveretchem, v'hareotem b'chatzutzot. If there'd be a war, what would you do? You would take these trumpets and you would blow a trua. And in so doing, you shall be remembered before God, because the blowing of the trua was also a form of tefillah, or crying out to God. And so that prayer gets responded to, or is answered by God. So the trua here, again, links to the going to war against their enemies. This is much more explicit. And the flip side, right? This is the first two psukim dealing with the camp of Israel in the desert. The next two psukim, Tet and Yud, deal with the extension of these roles into the role of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. If there be a war in the land of Israel, you will blow the trua sound. Uvayom simchatchem, on a day of celebration, which is Mefarshim understanding the pshat is that after you are victorious against your enemies, you have a simcha. So when you go to war against your enemies, you blow a trua. When you're victorious and you come back to celebrate, or in your holidays, that's when you blow a tekiah. We understand these concepts intuitively, because if you think about the notion of a trua sound to tell the camp they're about to go to war, and the tekiah sound to tell the camp that they're coming back from war, translate those sounds into modern terminology, and what do you have? Right? Again, if you're talking about it in the military context, the trua is more or less equivalent to what we call an air raid siren. Right? Sirens going, sound of sirens, olot v'yodot, going up and down. Going up and down is a sign that this is not a drill, that this is a time, right? That you have to go to shelter, and this is a preparation for war. Whereas the tekiah is more or less analogous to a straight sound, or a sound that's an all clear signal from a military perspective. And the siren role of modern warfare, and the trua and the shofar role of biblical warfare, very similar. The tekiah is an all clear sound. The trua is an air raid siren up and down. That's exactly the parallel. Or in the language of the Rambam, the shofar awakens us, but awakens us because we have to, right? The war is upon us. So the role of the shofar is very much connected to, or the chatzutzot in this case, very much connected to the concept of war. The question becomes only who is leading that battle in war, right? Who is standing at the head of that army. I'll show you two very powerful examples. I'm going to skip Yechezkel for a moment, I'll come back to it. But if you take a look, I'll show you two examples. One is Ehud. Now, Ehud is not a melech, but he is a shofet. And the role of the shoftim was very similar to that of the melech. The only difference between a shofet and a melech from a operational or job description perspective was that the shofet was essentially a regional leader and melech was a national leader. But if you think of the shofet as a judicial role, that's one aspect of the king, but the shofet was also the military leader of his tribe or region. I once heard the suggestion that the reason why the book of Shoftim, the leaders, military leaders, are called Shoftim, they're roughly equivalent to the Nasi of Chumash, where every tribe had a Nasi who led the tribe. And in the book of Shoftim, you had regions of the land of Israel, and they were led by Shoftim, not necessarily from the word shofet or judge, even though that's how we translate it, but possibly from the word shovet or shevet, meaning tribal leader. Another, which would explain why the shift in the language from shofet of the Torah, which is a judge, and a nasi of each tribe, whereas in the book of Shoftim, the nasi is called a shofet. So Ehud takes on that role with pre-Malchus, and so the role is that of a shofet. He is ready to go to war. Ehud was the one who killed the king of Moab. I won't describe how, because that would be, I don't know how many people have eaten already, so we won't go to that story. But after he escapes from the palace of king of Moab, the pasuk says, "Vayitka b'shofar b'har Ephraim, vayerdu imo bnei Yisrael min ha'ar v'hu lifnehem." He blew the shofar, and everybody came running from the mountains, and that's how. And vayomer alehem l'tvu achavai, and he said to them, "Follow me, and we're going to go to war against our enemies." Ki natan Hashem et avechem et Moab biyadchem. The role of the shofar here is very clear. The shofar was a call to war. The shofar was a tool to call the people to war. Similarly, in Sefer Shmuel, you have the story of Shaul when he is king or anointed king, and he goes to war. The war starts when Yonatan against the Plishtim, when Yonatan took out the garrison of the Philistines in Geva Binyamin. Vayishmu Plishtim, v'Shaul taka b'shofar b'chol haaretz lemor. And Shaul blew the shofar. Shaul blew the shofar in the land, saying, "Let all of the Hebrews hear." B'chol Yisrael shamu lemor hinei Shaul et netziv Plishtim v'gam nivash Yisrael Plishtim v'yitzaku ha'am acharei Shaul Gilgal. When Shaul blew the shofar, everybody followed Shaul to Gilgal. The army was ready for formation. So there's no question that the role of the shofar in Tanach was a musical instrument, but it wasn't music that was played out of the shofar. It was a call to arms. It was a call to follow the king into battle. Ehud blew the shofar, they followed him into battle. Shaul blew the shofar, they followed him into battle. So from that perspective, it's a military tool to acknowledge the king or to acknowledge the role of the battle. It has that military feel, war feel to it. Says the Torah, that's what the true and the tekiah represent. The true and the tekiah represent the broken cry, the air raid siren up and down is a call to war, and the tekiah is a call to an all clear sound that we're ready to return. And from that, there are drashot upon mountains of trying to figure out exactly what the symbolism is between the tekiah lefanah, tekiah lacharea. But every trua has to be surrounded by a tekiah. That's the halacha. We go tekiah, then trua, then tekiah, meaning that we go from a time of peace to a time of war, back to a time of peace. That there's this notion of a trua, which is this broken sound that represents the world in which we live in today, is in fact surrounded by both the past and the future of a tekiah. There's much to unpack there in terms of the philosophy of it, but the basic concept is the tekiah is blown, or the trua is blown to warn the people of the impending war, and therefore to call them to arms. Now, when the Rambam, yeah, sure.
It says in Bamidbar, I think it says Chatzotzrot. So where is the jump or the switch from Chatzotzrat to Shofar?
Because so I sort of alluded to that in half a sentence, which is that there's, from a functional perspective, the Chatzotzrot and the Shofar serve the same role. They, in the Mikdash, they were blown together. And there's a whole discussion in Masechet Hashana when you had two trumpets, one shofar, two shofars, one trumpet. They were used together in the Beit HaMikdash. It's a complex, from a halachic perspective, it's a little bit complex, but the concept of trua and tekiah is the same, whether it's being blown from a chatzotzrot or whether it's blown from a shofar. Why the mitzvah of Yom Truat Yelechem? was translated to a shofar of Rosh Hashanah rather than a chatzotzrot, I think that's where the role of Torah Shabbat Peh comes in to kind of to make that jump. But the terminology of where Trua and Tkiya comes from and the symbolism they represent as with terms that come from the world of war, that's really the critical message here. And then the shofar, which was the tool used by the kings to call the people to follow them into battle, that's clear in both instances here. There's one other which I skipped for now. And so it's not hard to make that jump. But you're right. In the Midbar, Moshe used chatzotzrot. Historically, we use the shofar on Rosh Hashanah.
And if the tki'ah is like to stop or to gather, and then the tru'ah is like to make you move, then why don't we start with tru'ah and then go to tki'ah?
So that's again, that gets back into the question before that I said about what the symbolism of the blast of the tki'ah, trua tki'ah of Rosh Hashanah is. There's much that would take us into a whole shir, but the simplest answer I can give you is when we blow the shofar, we're doing more than just calling us to war, in a sense. We'll see what that means in a second. But we're actually reflecting the whole gamut of history, from Gan Eden to Yemot HaMashiach, from Mamar Hasina to Yemot HaMashiach, from the process of our past, present, and future. So the true is always blanketed on each side by a tki'ah. Never stands by itself. That's already a whole different shir. But my goal here was to understand the trua and tki'ah symbolism as tools of war, as sounds of war, and the shofar is a tool to call the people to war, to call the people to arms, to say to them, the king has called, the people must answer. Now, that's one aspect of the concept of the shofar. There's another, and the Rambam, I think, is really picking up on the second piece of it, which is that when we talk about calling the people to war, there's a certain philosophical framework that one can use or one can see that's also the role of kind of awakening us to the quote unquote the war with the Yetzer Hara, or the war with ourselves, or the war internally in terms of our own we are essentially the source of the danger to ourselves, if you will, in the process of tshuva. I don't think that, again, from a Pshat perspective, I don't think that that's where I want to take it for our purposes to understand the shofar, but I think it's important to realize where the Rambam makes that jump. The other interesting observation, if we want to see another aspect of the role of the shofar as a call to war, if you will, or to call the siren that warns the people, Yechezkel has a really powerful mashal where he uses the notion of the watchman who guards a city and who blows the shofar for the purpose of warning the people about an impending danger. And that the nimshal there is the role of the Navi to warn the people to do tshuva. It's fascinating. And I think that that's also connected to what the Rambam was trying to do, which is to link what we know of in Tanach, which is that the shofar was a call to arms, to our concept of the Aser Shemei Tshuva as a process of tshuva. If you look at Yechezkel has this in chapter 33. And it says the following very simple mashal. It says, Ben Adam daber l'amcha ve'amarta lehem, eretz ki avi aleh acharav. If you have a land and the land is threatened by war, and so the people will designate one person from amongst them as a watchman, as a guard. And if he's standing at the top of the tower and he sees and he sees the sword coming upon the land, he sees the enemy army attacking, what's he going to do? He's going to blow the shofar. That's his job. When the rest of the people will hear the shofar, if they ignore it, and by ignoring it, they're not ready for the army, If the army attacks and the people are surprised by the attack, they're not ready because they ignored the watchman, so the watchman's not at fault. Et kol hashofar shama v'lo nizhar damo. If he heard the sound of the shofar but ignored it, then he is responsible for his own fate. Whereas, but if the watchman sees the sword, the army coming, and he ignores it and he doesn't sound the warning shofar, then if the people are caught off guard, then who is to blame? Damo miyad tzofeh et Rosh, then I will hold the watchman accountable. So the nimshal here continues where God says to Yechezkel, I have made you the watchman for the people of Israel. And you will listen, you will hear, and you will hear what you will listen to what I say, and you will warn the people. If I tell the wicked person that he's going to die because of his sins and he ignores me, that's his headache. Whereas if you so the nimshal here is to tell the people that I don't want you to die. On the contrary, I want you to live and I want you to repent. Shuvu mitachechem ha'ama tamutu beit Yisrael. But the notion of using a military threat as a symbol of the threat of our own sins and the consequences of our sins, that's already in the language of the of Yechezkel. That I think is where the Rambam links the two. The Rambam can take this concept that the shofar is a reminder of the impending battle and say, oh, the battle is with our sins and we have to do tshuva. That essentially is where this prophecy of the Navi Yechezkel parallels it. Now, he's not talking about Rosh Hashana, but the concept of using the shofar as the watchman, tool of the watchman of the tzofeh, and saying that that's the role of the Navi because the Navi is there to warn us about our sins, says the Rambam, that's where we can derive the fact that the shofar is a tool to inspire us to tshuva. Okay, so far what do we have? Moving forward for a moment, so far what we have essentially is a paradigm of the shofar as a tool in the Torah used by kings to call the people to arms. And the Navi Yechezkel who says, oh, wait a second, that's also the role of the watchman to warn the people, the Navi to warn the people about the sins, and he is compared to the watchman with the shofar. Says the Rambam, oh, I see the shofar as a call to tshuva. Fine. However, none of that really addresses the role of shofar in the tefillah. When we look at the bracha of shofrot, when we look at the text of the tefillah itself, something else entirely emerges, and that's a mystery. Again, from a Tanach perspective, the shofar is a tool of war, used by the kings to call the people to arms. We have another role of the shofar, which we'll see in a moment, to coronate kings. Right? It was used of trumpets, and the shofar was also used in the coronation of kings. And we'll talk. That was one of the other references we'll see in a second. Or the Gemara in Rosh Hashana made that reference, Ubameh b'shofar. But in the tefillah of shofar, there's no war that's described, and doesn't seem to be a coronation process going on. What's the bracha of shofar focused on? So let's just take a look at it. We're going to, a couple of weeks, and we're going to be reciting this in shul. Atani gleita be'anan kvodecha al am kodshecha ledaber imam. You, God, revealed in your cloud of your glory to your holy people when you spoke to them. Min hashamayim yishmatam kolecha, you let them hear your voice from the heavens. V'nigleita aleim be'arpalei tohar, and you revealed yourself in the pure clouds. Gam kol olam kulo chal mipanecha uvriot breshit chardu mimeka, the entire world trembled when you revealed yourself, our King, on Mount Sinai, Galotcha Malkeinu al Har Sinai, to teach Torah and mitzvot to the Jewish people, L'lamed le'amcha Torah mitzvot, and you revealed yourself in the sound of your voice, and the dibrot you gave them out of the fire. Later you appeared to them in sounds and in trembling and in shouting. Uvakol shofar alehem hofata, and you appeared to them through the sound of the shofar. This is about Ma'amad HaSinai. And the psukim here describe Ma'amad HaSinai, in which the shofar was used. We start to look at the psukim, all the 3 psukim in the Torah that talk about the shofar. Well, other psukim we just went through psukim that talked about the chatzotzot, the other psukim that talk about shofar. No, we talk specifically here, we quote the psukim that deal with the role of the shofar at Ma'amad HaSinai, and only at Ma'amad HaSinai. The people saw the voices, they saw the sounds, they saw the sound that the sound of the shofar and the mountain trembling, and they stood back in fear. Those are the psukim we quote in the mitzvah of, in the tefillah of Tkiyat Shofar. Then we talk about psukim from Tehillim, and we quote, the first one is the pasuk is Perek Mem Zayin, which we read the entire Perek before we blow the shofar. Allah Elokim b'truah Hashem b'kol shofar. God arises in the sound of the truah, or the sound of the shofar. B'chatzotzrot v'kol shofar hariu lifnei HaMelech Hashem. The answer to your question before about the relationship between the chatzotzot and the shofar. They're interchangeable from a Tanach perspective. The chatzotzot v'kol shofar hariu lifnei HaMelech, call out to before the king God. Tiku b'chodesh shofar. And similarly, psukim in the Nevi'im. The psukim in the Nevi'im talk about something else completely. We'll come back to that at the end of the shir today. The psukim in the Nevi'im quote three psukim that talk about the role of the shofar to gather the exiles from and bring them back to the land of Israel. The nes here referring to is a banner to call the people. When you blow the shofar, they will hear. Right, you blow the great shofar, and all the people will come back from their exile. God appeared to them. This is coming out like an arrow. And everybody will, to protect the people. And we're going to come back to that piece of it in a moment, and the final tefillah, which is about redemption, So it's fascinating. The tefillah of shofar deals with none of the themes we've just discussed. We talked about the shofar as a call to war, and we talked about the shofar as a tool of coronation, possibly. That's the Gemara. Or a inspiration to tshuva, says the Rambam, based on the psukim in Yechezkel. Well, the bracha of shofar talks about Ma'amad HaSinai, where the shofar was used to warn the people not to touch the mountain, and talks about kibbutz galuyot. Those are 2 completely different contexts to the mitzvah of shofar. What is the connection between these 2 moments, Ma'amad HaSinai on the one hand, and kibbutz galuyot, the revelation on the one hand, and the ingathering of the exiles? What does that have to do with the concept of the shofar as a tool to call the people to war? The mystery deepens when we start to look at the only other context in which we use the shofar. The shofar is blown on Rosh Hashana. There's one other place where the shofar, or a time where the shofar is blown on the Yomim Noraim. I'm not talking about Chodesh Elul, but that's a much later minhag. But where the shofar is used on the Yomim Noraim besides Rosh Hashanah, there's one other place, which is
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur.
The end of Yom Kippur, correct. The end of Yom Kippur. The final blast at the end of the davening. Why do we blow the shofar at the end of Ne'ilah? So fascinatingly, the Maharil says that the reason we blow the shofar at the end of Rosh Hashanah is
interesting.
It's talking about why we say Hashem Elokim 7 times at the end of Ne'ilah. That's not our issue for now. Shu siman l'siluk shchina shemistakleket ve'ola lamala min zayin rikim. We say Hashem Elokim 7 times, says the Maharil, because we are escorting the Shekhinah as it's leaving us and returning it to the 7 heavens above us. As it says, Allah Elokim b'truah Hashem b'kol shofar. Therefore, we say, Shofar, achar hashofar aliyah v'siluk. The Shekhinah is following the shofar going up to the heavens. Or, as quoted by the Taz in Tafresh, in the Shulchan, on his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch in Tafresh Chav Gimel, Atam hamuvchar l'tkiya zu. Why do we blow the shofar at Ne'ilah? Says the Taz, Shu siman l'siluk shchina l'ma'ala. Shenemar Allah l'kim b'truah. It's a sign of the Shekhinah departing and going up to heavens, as it says God ascends with the Truah. That's the pasuk in Tehillim. Allah Elokim b'truah, Hashem b'kol shofar. The problem I have with this interpretation, both the Taz and the Maharil, suggest that the blowing of the shofar at Ne'ilah is a symbol of the shofar of the Shekhinah leaving us, of the Shekhinah returning to heaven. The parak of Tehillim that we recite, Allah Elokim b'truah, Hashem b'kol shofar, and continue with Ki melech kol haaretz Elokim, God is king over the entire world. Zamu maskil, call out, sing, understand, right? God, Malach Elokim Elokim, God reigns over the entire world, over all the nations. Nobles of the world will gather to acknowledge God as king. Zamu Elokim Zameru. We blow the shofar in this parak to coronate God. Right? That's the concept of Malchus, that we're coronating God. I said there's another notion of coronation, and the role of the shofar in coronation is clearly evident in this parak of Tehillim. That is not a pasuk that talks about God leaving us. It's talking about God returning to us. It's the phrase is backwards. The truth is, where does this come from? It comes from, and I'll show you another verse. Here's Shemot Parak Yud Tet. I'll show you another verse. Moshe, right before Ma'amad Sinai, Shemot Yud Tet, and again, all this has to come back to Ma'amad Sinai. V'gbaltat am saviv lemor, go and set a border around the mountain, saying that nobody's allowed to come up the mountain. Anybody touches the mountain will die. Lo tigabo ki sako yisekelu yado yireh. Whether man or beast, bimshoch hayovel lehem ya'alu bahar. What does the phrase mean? Bimshoch hayovel lehem ya'alu bahar. When the horn is drawn, when the shofar is blasted or withdrawn, right? What does that mean? The horn is drawn. Lehem ya'alu bahar. So based on that pasuk, the Gemara says, and this is how the Rishonim, the Maharil and the Taz understand it, that when the shofar nistalka shchina shechem etzinu b'har Sinai shekol zman sheshchina shvuya alav amrat Torah gam atzon v'abakar yiru, as long as the shchina rested on Har Sinai, the people were not allowed to touch the mountain. Whereas nistalka shchina mimenu, when the Shekhinah left, then the Torah says, what does that mean? Says Rashi, it means that when they blew the shofar an extra long, Tkir Gdola, Kol Aroch, that's Siman Siluk Shekhinah, that's a sign that the Shekhinah is left. And from that, the Maharil says, so when do we blow that great shofar? We blow that big, long shofar at the end of Ne'ilah. There's a sign that the Shekhinah is departing. We were with the Shekhinah for 10 days, Rosh Hashana to Yom Kippur, right? He is karov to us. At the end of Ne'ilah, we escort the Shekhinah back to Shemayim. So says the Taz and the Maharil, based on this phrase, Mimshoch hayovel hema ya'alu bahar. It's almost as if to suggest that the blowing of this shofar was a sign that that the Shekhinah was departing. Problem with that again, we are using all the shofar is used at the beginning of the story of Ma'amad Sinai to reflect the presence of the Shekhinah, and the shofar is used at the end of Ma'amad Sinai to reflect the departing of the Shekhinah. A little bit of a contradiction. So here's another possibility. How would you understand the following verse? The people saw the voices, they saw the fire. And they saw and heard the sound of the shofar. They saw the mountain burning. They were afraid and they stood back from afar. And they said to Moshe, "You speak, daber ta'iman, and then we'll hear. Don't have God speak to us because we'll all die. We can't handle the process." Moshe reflects on that same concept in Dvarim Perek Hey, where he reflects back 40 years later and he says, "Panim bepanim diber Hashem imachem." God spoke to you face to face. Bahar mitoch ha'esh, on the mountain from the fire. Anochi omed ben Hashem ubenechem be'et ha'i. I stood between you and the people, and you and God. Why did I stand between you? To act as an intermediary, to speak to God on your behalf. Ki yeretem mipnei ha'esh velo alitem bahar. Because you were afraid of the fire, and you did not come up the mountain. Understand the problem this verse creates for us? On the one hand, we just finished saying that the blowing of the shofar represented the end, the Shekhinah's departing of our Sinai. Now it's a mountain, you can go up, no problem. Kolzman, that the Shekhinah was coming down on the mountain, you weren't allowed to touch it. Now that the Shekhinah has departed, says the Taz and the Gemara and Tainis, now that the Shekhinah has departed, they can come up the mountain, the Shekhinah is gone. In this pasuk in Devarim, it says the exact opposite. That God wanted them to come up the mountain when God's presence was still there. But we were afraid. We were afraid, and therefore we didn't go up the mountain. But the intent, says this pasuk, was always that we should go up the mountain and commune with God, to be there with the divine presence, not to wait for Moshe, for the Shekhinah to leave and then to come up the mountain. No, Pasuk says we were originally supposed to join Moshe on the mountain, but the people were so afraid that they stood back and they said to Moshe, "You speak for us. We don't want to go up. Therefore, Yereitem mipnei ha'esh velo alitem bahar." This is what Rav David Tzvi Hoffman says in his interpretation of that verse. He says, originally, originally God was going to give all the mitzvot to all the Jewish people, all together on Mount Sinai, just like the Aseret HaDibrot. However, they were afraid. Kivan she'am nechrad ve'amad merachok. So therefore, they had no choice. So the people went up the mountain. So the Moshe went up the mountain, and the people stood back. But the phrase "bimshoch hayovel hemi alu bahar" doesn't mean the Shekhinah is leaving, and now the mountain is no different from any other mountain. It means that the Shekhinah is present. The Shekhinah is calling. The Melech is calling his army, and the people have to answer. The people have to come. If the shofar is sounding bimshoch hayovel, when the sound is clear, when the sound is blasted by the king, we follow by coming, by answering the call and saying, "I'm here, command me. I'm your army." That's what
Weren't we told that if we touched the mountain that we would die?
As the Shekhinah was coming down the mountain, as the noise was happening, as the landslides were happening, and then when the Shekhinah arrives, like in the Beit HaMikdash, bimshoch hayovel, hemi alu bahar, then let them come up and join you. That's exactly the interpretation. It's fascinating, but it fits if you think about this pasuk in Devarim, that the only reason we didn't go up the mountain was because we were afraid of the fire. That's exactly the interpretation. And I'll prove to you that this is correct. The fascinating proof, and if David in his continuation, he uses this as a proof, but it's fascinating. Now, I unfortunately, the way this is laid out, I can't put the Hebrew and the English on the screen at the same time. So I apologize for that. I'll translate as we go. This translation is on the source page below. There's a psukim in Yeshua, in the conquest of Yericho, that are very similar to Mammon HaSinai. You remember the story of how they brought the walls down of Yericho? The 7 times they surrounded the mountain for 7 days, and they did these circuits or hakafot around the mountain each day, blowing the shofar. And on the 7th day, they did 7 circuits. That's where our hakafot is modeled after the hakafot around the Beit HaMikdash or around the Mizbeach, but also around Yericho. Similar kind of experience. That story begins when Yeshua is encamped outside of Yericho, and he sees a vision. And God says to him through his malach, through his angel, Sar Tzavah Hashem, this angel who is the ministering general of God's army, the angel in charge of the army of God, Sar Tzavah Hashem, says to Yeshua, Shal na'alcha mi'al raglecha ki makom asher ata omed alav kodeshu. Take your shoe off from your feet because your land you stand on is holy ground. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Right? That is exactly the same phrase God said to Moshe at the burning bush when he stood at Har Sinai. Har Elokim. And God said, this is a holy mountain. And Yericho is completely surrounded. Nobody comes in, nobody goes out. There was a siege on Yericho. And God instructed Yeshua, God instructed Yeshua via the Malach, each day for 6 days you will surround the city once. And on the 7th day, V'shiv'a kohanim yis'u shiv'a shofrot hayovlim, 7 kohanim who will carry and blow 7 shofrot of the ram, shofrot hayovlim. That's where the phrase shofar comes from. It's the horn of the ram. Lifnei ha'aron, before the ark, and on the 7th day, you will surround the city 7 times. Now listen carefully. Here's the verse that we read before in Shmot Yutet. When the shofar blasts, they will go up the mountain. What does it say in Yeshua? Bimshoch bekeren hayovel. When the horn of the yovel is sounded. When you hear the sound of the shofar, call out in a great calling, great screaming, great shouting, and let the walls fall, and the people will come into the city. The context here is so clearly parallel. And the message is that that's exactly what was supposed to happen at Har Sinai. The shofar was blown at the end of God's presence, God coming, the entourage arriving, in order for us to come up the mountain and then be there together for that revelation. Right? Why is this important? Because the whole notion of Mammon HaSinai, which is the power, when we say that God appeared on Har Sinai as part of the tefillah of shofar, what's the connection? The connection is that the shofar was used at Mammon HaSinai not just to frighten the people, not just to warn the people, but to represent God's presence. Everybody take a step back. Answer the following question. Who blows the shofar? We blow the shofar in Rosh Hashana, right? According to the Rambam, we're blowing the shofar to remind everybody to do tshuva. I'm saying it's the other way around.
Kohanim blow shofar.
In the context of Yericho, in the context of the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohanim blew the shofar. In the context of Mammon HaSinai, doesn't say, right? The reason it doesn't say who blew the shofar is because the assumption goes together with the kolot and vrakim and kol shofar chazak ma'od, kol shofar holech v'chazek, Moshe yidaber v'elokim yanenu b'kol. Doesn't say who blew the shofar, but the symbolism is who is blowing the shofar.
Hashem is blowing the shofar.
Correct. God is blowing the shofar. Why is God blowing the shofar? Why is God blowing the shofar? Because the shofar is a tool used to coronate kings. We blow the shofar to coronate the king, but the king blows the shofar to call the army to war,
Yeah, like
to
Shaul.
call his soldiers to respond.
Mm.
And so the blowing of the shofar at Har Sinai was God's way of saying, I am your king. Here is the shofar. I'm blowing it. You are my army. Now you come to me and you respond and you answer the call. That's precisely what was supposed to happen at Har Sinai. Sidebar, it didn't happen that way, but that was the concept. In the middle of the psukim we quote from Tehillim talk about us blowing the shofar to coronate God as king. But then look at the third group of psukim that we quote. The third group of psukim that we quote are from the Nevi'im, and they're all about God blowing the shofar and the people following. Right? Kitkoa shofar tishma. When you blow the shofar, they'll come. The people will come from the exiles to return to the land of Israel because they're following you, God. God blows the shofar. And that's how the tefillah of shofar ends. God, Elokeinu, Elokei Avotenu, Tekah b'shofar gadol acheretenu. You blow the great shofar of the redemption. It's not we who blow the shofar. The shofar is, says the Gemara, which is a tool to coronate the king. That's true. That's only one dimension of the shofar. The shofar is a tool. We use the shofar, the chatzatrot, to coronate God as king. But in the context of the role of the shofar used by kings, it was the king who blew the shofar. And the king blew the shofar to call his army to him. And in this case, the analogy is exactly the same, both at Har Sinai and at the concept of Geula. God blows the shofar. We are his soldiers. And we respond by saying, Hineni, here I am. I'm here. Command me. I'm at Har Sinai. I'm going up the mountain. Command me. Tell me what to do. And so when we come back to Rosh Hashana, and we come back to the theme of Malchut, on Yom Kippur is a different story. We'll talk about Yom Kippur over the next couple of sessions. But the theme of Rosh Hashanah primarily is one of God's authority, both to judge us, zichronot, and to command us, which is the melech model of the war. We are the soldiers. We are the soldiers who followed God, or should have followed God, up to Har Sinai. We are the soldiers who want to follow God in the redemption to the land of Israel. God is our judge. We acknowledge the role of the king to judge us, zichronot. God is our commander, as in an army, and we are his foot soldiers, and we follow his command, Gzerot Melech. So the two themes of Malchut on Rosh Hashanah, Zichronot and Shofrot, link back to this primary message. Malkeinu, that's what it's all about. I was just thinking about a shir I gave Shabbos afternoon this week, which was about the phraseology of Avinu Malkeinu. And I made the observation that Avinu Malkeinu is essentially reflects, there's a uniqueness to that phrase of Avinu Malkeinu. It comes from the Gemara and Taanis story of Rabbi Akiva, not a subject for now. But the paradigm of im kivanim, im ka'avadim, if you judge us as king, judge us as your children, one or the other. But the real paradigm is that on Rosh Hashanah, he is Malkeinu. Rosh Hashanah is all about Malchut. He is our judge. He is our commander. We are his soldiers. That's what the theme of Malchut represents. On Yom Kippur, we come to him and ask for love and clemency and rachamim. Yom Kippur is Avinu. So the Avinu Malkeinu model is actually about the two anchors of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The phrase is backwards, right? It should be Malkeinu Avinu, but nonetheless, it rolls off the tongue as Avinu Malkeinu. Rosh Hashanah is about Malchus. Yom Kippur is about rachamim and compassion and love and the model of the clemency that we ask from God. So that's the paradigm that I wanted to share with you. The notion that on Rosh Hashanah we are essentially doing two things. We're acknowledging the authority of the court on the one hand, and we are acknowledging that as God blows the shofar, we answer, we respond, we come to the army of God, if you will, by saying Hineni. That's our answer to the shofar, not that we blow. We only blow it physically, but its manifestation is that God is blowing the shofar and we are answering that call. I will stop here and take questions.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Okay. The root of the word shofar is shin pei resh, which is leshaper. So I don't know, in Vayikra Rabbah it says, like תקעו בחודש הזה שופר, כי בחודש הזה תשפרו מעשיכם. So I think
that's I'm not sure that would work in a Tanach context. It's a nice drasha.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying why dafka shofar? No, because it bothered me. It's not, I didn't find...
The shofar is shofar Yovel.
No, בסדר, and not חצוצרה. So I'm saying if it's connected to the shin pei reish...
No, it's a different issue. The reason we blow a shofar, not a chatzotzra, so shofar is an animal horn. It comes from a yovel. It comes from a ram, whereas the chatzotzra is man-made. Yes. God doesn't blow a man-made trumpet. Right. God blows the shofar of the ram. So if the shofar represents that blown by the king, whether it be an earthly king or whether it be the heavenly king, I don't think the chatzotzra would have been the tool for that reflection. But the drasha is very nice, but I don't think it's a pshat context of Tanakh. I think
it's not the Tanakh. I'm just saying it's connected to the message of Rosh Hashana.
I have to explore whether shaper is a modern Hebrew word or a biblical Hebrew word, but that's
Rabbi is not modern, but okay.
No, but it may not be biblical.
Yeah. Okay.
Have to separate. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Any other questions? My pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we're going to take a completely different direction. And I don't remember what's on the schedule for next week, whether it's Rosh Ezra or LeDavid, but in either case, it'll take us into a different realm. This unit we finished.
I'd like to point something out, if I may.
Sure.
The Meir Soloveitchik points out in a podcast that the Adon Olam of Ibn Gabirol says, Le'et nasa b'cheftzako, that we validate Hashem in the court as our Melech. I've put this idea into a poem which will be published in the Jewish Journal at the end of this week, in which I maintain that the Malchiot validate Hashem as a Melech. What sort of Melech? Constitutional monarchy. He is authorized by us. Bimshof Hayovel, which you correctly emphasize in your wonderful Dvar Torah, actually is the authorization of the Israelites, of Hashem, echoing the blowing of the shofar when they blow the shofar.
Interesting idea. The way I presented it last week was that we ask God to reign over us, meaning it is conceivable to have a melech who is not involved in our world. And so when we coronate God, we're inviting God into our world to ask and to guide it, to guide us and to guide the world. So a similar idea, a little bit of a different presentation, but it's a similar concept. Okay, very good.
God who according to the Tanur of Achan.
Yeah, it gets complicated. I don't want to spend too much time on that right now, but I hear you. Okay, I'll look forward to reading it. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Very much.
Thank you. Wonderful share.
We will see you all next week.
Bye.